Decadent Movement. Now, in terms of its literary periodization, certainly we can place it after realism, naturalism, and next to it comes Decadent Movement. And Decadent Movement, as it is stated, decadent art of the 1880s and 1890s, they were associated with cultural had been developing among European intellectuals since the late 18th century and had become intensified with the more specific say, discourse of degeneration. Now, what happened? The moment I utter this word, decadence simply means, although of course it certainly means going down, falling down from a better moral state, but decadence also meant self-indulgent. Decadence also meant self-indulgence in an excessive or unrestrained way, unrestrained manner, which ultimately led to the fall of from one's moral states. So decadent, and of course decadent has been such, think of the number of these Roman emperors, Roman, say, statesmen, think of Caligula, think of Nero, think of Annibales, who were known primarily for their cruelty, for their sexual perversions. So decadence not just meant a downfall from the higher moral state to a lower one, or the ability to be indulge in oneself to a greater extent, or excessive or unrestrained gratification of one's one's appetite, one's desire. Generally speaking, the meaning of the word, one's whims and fancies. Decadence in literature was catering to an important aspect of understanding or perceiving reality, and that is probably it, and it is quite contradictory in nature as well. Contradictory as well as paradoxical. How? Because decadence by its very, say, contradiction that I was talking of, it was truly pernicious, it was in a way truly harmful, yet the very way to receive or to reach the levels of betterment went through the very idea of self-indulgence. What do I mean by it? Think of William Blake. William Blake in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he clearly states that the road of excess leads ultimately to the palace of wisdom. The road of excess leads ultimately to the palace of wisdom. This means the very nature of excess, that is, the very nature of decadence, was something which was paradoxical in nature. That is, what is excess and what is wisdom? Doesn't wisdom has to do with engaging in that very living whose wholesome logic is to remain within moderation, and this too much or excessive emphasis on moderation, this is nothing but an idea of too much of self-indulgence. So what William Blake and the decadent writers have somehow also taken, when it comes to their own explanation and overt use of self-indulgence, or that the use of the sexual perversions that they have taken into account in decadent novels, what they were employing, what underlying logic had been, when William Blake explained that what you know, you can only predict how far you do not know. So this is how is the paradoxical nature of decadence. That is, one cannot reach these stages of wisdom unless one has fallen down, unless one has fallen from that very moral state, right? So this was the paradoxical nature of the decadence in general, and this is what the underlying philosophy of these fiction writers was, to discover such characters, such experiences, and remain themselves, confine themselves, these characters, in such a way. I'll come down to how the typical protagonist of a decadent movement would look like. So these characters would be constructed in such a manner that in order to ultimately achieve that wisdom, has to go through the path of excess. It has to go through the path of self-indulgence. It has to go through the path of resorting to or giving away to, or in a way quitting all that kinds of wisdom to the powers of perversity, to the powers of that very notion of excess, right? And in literature, if I take into account, and of course it was again thanks to the French were not just ruling say, they were primarily ruling in ideations, and they were primarily being very innovative, and that is how by 19th century France, or French society, which has witnessed Renaissance in its most late stages, became by 19th century how, quite contradictorily, quite paradoxically, the cultural hub of the entire European civilization. And this was again, decadence was also a European phenomena in the last 2 decades, that is in 1880s onwards. This was coming up as a phenomena. This was characterized by a wholesome logic or morbidity of macabre subjects, of neurotic way of approaching sexuality, and over using an overly refined style, using such characters who would primarily be sexually pervasive, who would be hedonistic in nature, hedonistic, that these protagonists would simply be confining themselves to their own cocoons. They would live in their almost hermit-like cocoons, and they would create for themselves this private world, this private invertebrate self-consuming world, where they are free to explore their sexuality, their pervasiveness. Although one criticism against decadent movement had been they were misogynist as well. I'll come down to the criticism of it. But a typical hero of a protagonist, or protagonist of a decadent literature, would be someone who would confine himself like a hermit in his own cocoon world, and is free to explore upon its morbidity, on its sexuality, on its sexual perversions, and so forth. So a decadent protagonist would somehow present a spectacular way by which sexuality, in fact kinky sexuality, would be explored, and aestheticism, but which would be marred by a lot of diseased sexuality, right? So this was something, this was, and then of course these characters would be typically functioning against the expectations of the society. For them, the word would appear to be very lax, very relaxed one, and just as, in fact, in these novels, it may appear that these protagonists are working in a very lax world, but this was again very mimetic. This was this apparent untidiness over of that unity of that novel in itself was mimetic in nature. Think of these different characters. Think of this, this particular character. I'm forgetting the name for the moment. Huysmans' character, or think of Il Picciare, that is by D'Annunzio, Italian decadent writer D'Annunzio, or think of our very own Oscar Wilde's The Picture of the Dorian Gray. The Dorian Gray, in fact, Gray was one of the most decadent character who exhibited his kinky sexuality, yet at the same time, as William Blake said, that the road to excess ultimately has to go through the palace of, it is the excess that one achieves this palace of wisdom. So again, Dorian Gray indulges in that very act of kinky sexuality, and with the use of Yellow Book, of course I'll come down to the reference, the Yellow Book, he ultimately achieves this very idea of decadence to achieve its wisdom. Decadem as a term itself was used since Roman antiquity to refer to the phenomena of moral or cultural decay, deviance from the social norm, physical or moral laxity, perversion, or effeminate demeanor. The poets and the artists, they would ridicule and expose the characters as decadents in the 1990s, and they embrace this term and use it to distance themselves from the rigid norms of Victorian Britain. And a very paradoxical nature of the times had been that despite the fact that these writers were trying to explore the idea of decadence through their art, fairly European society was at peace. So 1880s, certainly these tensions that led to ultimately the Civil War and of course the World War later on were existent, but more or less these societies used to be peaceful society of the 1890s. I'm talking about 1895. I'm talking about 1895, and then by 1900, 1910, we see that the world started, the different power structures internationally started to get withered away, started to get shaken. And though we do find that avant-gardism taking shape here, and avant-gardism, symbolism, in fact, if I consider decadence as to be a parent category, then symbolism, avant-gardism, or that very nation of impressionistic art, they were decadence progeny, nothing but decadence movement progeny in nature. Now, coming back to the very idea, the reason had been it was coming down of from the assault on nature by the Industrial Revolution, and that is depicting itself 1800 onwards, the threat to traditional forms of society represented by the French Revolution, the challenge to the concept of a rational and autonomous human agency adumbrated by Schuffenzer. Then Schuffenzer was a German, again, he was known to a German philosopher, was known as the sad prince of pessimism, the messenger of misery. Why I've taken his reference? Because his important work somehow contributed to that very idea of philosophy that when society is generally has morally decayed from the spiritual realms of the earlier times, and it has seen itself being engaged into a number of these revolutions in past, but a general decay, a general degeneration of its morals, of its spirituality, of its everyday moves, somehow results in a kind of quaint, a kind of queer peace, right? So the peace that I talked of, that these the European civilization all over, in fact, if I take into account at least of Scandinavia, Austria, Germany, they were fairly certainly against the regimes of the time, but not in terms of that the common civilians would go out and vote and carry out these revolutions, and excluding for the moment Spain. So this decadence, Spanish, think of Spanish literature, think of these stories and the theater scene that in Spanish literature and of course in Spanish theater, they were certainly against the Primo Rivera regime, Primo Rivera dictatorship regime, but at the same time they shrunk themselves, these theater artists, these theater writers, they shrunk themselves from the political of the times, and they were still moving towards entirely towards arts for art's sake. And arts for art's sake helped them explore, though they shunned themselves from the outside society, but it helped them to explore the kinkiness that could be experimented with in terms of sexuality and general perversiveness that has entered the society of the times. The challenges occurred, the rebuke of the Enlightenment era of the progress embodied by the second law of thermodynamics, and the undermining of the revealing. This is something Charles Darwin's theory of species that somehow had shaken the entire 1850s of the different countries, the different continents and countries of the European civilization. And it was certainly a particular work that made the atheist man as to be a justifiable one. And that's when he is free to explore his own life and his own sexuality. This is where decadence started to gain its impetus. Okay? That decadent work often celebrated deviant sexualities and amoral behaviors as deliberate affronts to middle class morality, and look back nostalgically to periods in which aristocratic tastes were. Now, if I think of the representative authors, or maybe someone who could be regarded as a precursor of this, then French one, Mallarmé, Rimbaud, and Baudelaire certainly was starting to moving ahead with the conventional forms of romanticism, and Baudelaire particularly enjoyed that massive importance in the prehistory of decadentism. Although, if you have to think of who would be the father of decadence or maybe the patriarch of decadentism, this would be Mallarmé. But Mallarmé and Rimbaud and the steps that they left, the footsteps that they left behind, were certainly picked up by Baudelaire and explored well through their symbolic verses and theories. Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire was one of them. Also a precursor to a number of these movements in, say, symbolism, in aestheticism, but decadence was also rightly explored by, in France, of course, Charles Baudelaire. I'll one by one come to who all can be regarded, say, Oscar Wilde in Britain, Charles Swinburne in Britain, again, who were indulging in that very art of decadent movement, or experimenting with the ideas of extremities, the moral degeneration of the society. In fact, the very avant-garde that I've been suggesting, if I call decadent movement to be the parent category, its progenies would be symbolism, its progenies would be impressionistic art of 1920s. Its progenies would be the overall avant-gardist movement that took place in around 1925 and 30s, and of course later on as well. Different practices that were becoming the part of fiction, poetry, say different other genres, say theater as well. Right? And this is where we find Bertolt Brecht radically thinking of moving ahead with realism, naturalism, and thinking of epic theater. This is where we find that bottle dredge way of writing or dealing with theatre, that nothing to do with what Mr. Aristotle's Poetics has been suggesting. All he has suggested of art being, or theatre being, or dramatic performances primarily function for pleasure, they all have been wrong. The very idea is to invoke the emotions of these, to take these audiences along and to force them, to make them in an unrested manner, to make them think about what is happening on stage. So all thanks to this avant-gardist form, they found somehow got their impetus from the decadent literature, the decadent movement. Okay, so, but this did not just reflect itself in the discourse of degeneration in their works, they also responded to it by celebrating this perversiveness. They turned the idea of decadence into productive aesthetic sensibility, one that paradoxically became more vivid and alive as it embraced decay and death. So if I come to think of, again, the zeitgeist of it, that I've been using the term, the general spirit of the times, this was the responsible one had been religion. Western society by now, by 1900, has completely fallen apart in terms of religion. It was almost as if they were hounded by, they were scared by these natural sciences, religion, religious faith. They both took a refuge, they both were sidelined under the cruel forces of, say, natural sciences or the exploration of these various philosophies of pragmatism, empiricism, and the very idea of question of existence that has come into being, and the very Nobel idea of that it somehow has kept the entire European civilization intact, the very Nobel idea of Christian brotherhood. This Christian brotherhood was somehow started to get questioned. This Christian brotherhood was started to be unworthy of its existence, and that somehow gave rise to the desire for greed, the desire for competition, and this somehow Christian brotherhood was substituted by more cutthroat competition. Was given thanks to all these consequences and long-term consequences of industrial revolution, or the idea that Darwin saying God is dead, or the church an institution finding itself, because again marred by a lot of superstition in themselves and dogmatic views, found itself under question and found itself under a lot of questioning by the common masses. So this discarding of religion altogether, or this question of the validity of religion, somehow you know, elaborated and enhanced or made this call, the clarion call for degeneration, a more perversive one, a more appealing one in general. Now, come to think of in different, say, literature, say in British literature, as I said that Oscar Wilde in a way inspired the decadence literature. Is the picture of the Dorian Gray, an important decadent novel, an interesting one as well. Clearly a rage in his times, clearly burnt out, banned as well, had to face censorship. Then Charles Swinburne, again an illustrator, I think this was discussed before as well, Aubrey Beardsley, they all were associated with the Yellow Book. Now, the Yellow Book was a periodical that was carried out in 1894, till I think 1897 for a couple of years. Then it was again censored. And this Yellow Book is the same Yellow Book that was given by Lord Henry in Dorian Gray, the picture of the Dorian Gray, which ultimately became the reason for Dorian Gray's corruption. So this finds its echoes in this book as well. And probably we can think of certain other of its parallel in the other side of the continent. So if in 1894, the Yellow Book was in vogue, this literary periodical was in vogue, and this finds an echo in the picture of the Dorian Gray in the novel as well. The other side of the continent, America, we have Gilman writing about a particular story called The Yellow Wallpaper. Now, the spun on that very word, or the innuendo behind the very color yellow, is of course problematic, and of course critics have indulged in a lot of its exploration as to what it could mean, right? And there is absolutely no coincidence or some surreptitious way of discovering, or that both of them tended to be yellow in color. Of course, there had been reasons behind it as well. So Oscar Wilde shared Huysmans' aesthetic aim. Huysmans, again, his against nature, his very important work against nature, was something that found its echo, was quite rebellious in those times. And of course, it dealt with being against nature, how this character, Sentis, he indulges in the world of his own, hedonistic protagonist who is cocooned to his own world and exclusively indulges in sexual perversion. So Oscar Wilde shared Huysmans' aesthetic aim to reestablish. Huysman is re-establishing barriers between life and art. His essay, The Decay of Lines, defines the true decadence, a critical manifesto, true decadence from which we are now suffering as the final stage of cultural decline, when life gets the upper hand and drives art out into the wilderness. Now, a lot of great deal of criticism came against decadence movement and the way these artists were indulging in the times, especially in terms of their kinky sexuality, sexual perversiveness, etc. But the only reason, as Oscar Wilde in that very next statement, he says that when art has to be produced in its best form, in its optimum form, it must be detached from emotions. That means emotions, and says all bad poetry springs from genuine feelings. Emotions to be kept aside, there is a need to explore things in its exteriority. And this is where the extreme idea of kinkiness, of self-indulgence, or that very idea or notion that William Blake has somehow explained, that the road to wisdom ultimately has to lead through use of excess. This somewhere became a clarion call, became a foundational philosophy, foundational reasoning for these decadent writers to ultimately perceive that wisdom. Okay, or as Wilde puts it tersely in the beginning of his early poem, okay. To drift with every passion till my soul is a strange lute on which all winds can play. Is it for this that I have given away my ancient wisdom and austerity? Then next one. Zeitgeist, as I said, the spirit of the age, extremely important. There was a host of factors that prompted public discussion of this so-called overall degeneration of the society. It included France's humiliation after Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 1871. As I said, it was more or less a queer peace that was prevailing in these societies. Queer peace, a kind of disoriented peace that was almost functioning as a surface, say, cover that did not allow these pitfalls, these shortcomings to reveal themselves quite glaringly. And this glaring opening up of these pitfalls and shortcomings we find by the turn of the century, 1910, 1920s, when these different countries, across different countries, think of Austria, think of Scandinavia, think of Spain for that matter. 1920s, in fact 35, they saw these two civil wars, important civil wars, and Primo de Riviera's dictatorship was called into question. Although again, it went back to the fascist regime by Francisco Franco, but till then, the movement, this disruption has started to bother the society, and they were not now trying to cover up with the sense of, a complete whitewash of how this can be pushed in the background, or pushed in the, or sidelined in the background. So statistics reveal that the birth rates were declining, suicides increased, there was this upsurge of labor unrest, there was feminist agitation, there was this, all things were almost as if the society was a cauldron in which all these things, all these factors were simmering now. And they ultimately find themselves up by the turn of the century when these forces, when the civil unrest finally took its ugliest form, they were on roads protesting against as well. So lurid media depictions of the spread of these diseases, recourse to crime, drugs, alcohol, etc. Writers such as Gustave Flaubert, Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud had demonstrated that such insalubrious facts could be both transmuted and transcended by making them as the subject matter of art. Then Anatole Barjot. Now Anatole Barjot, if we think of some of the writers who were projecting, they were, though they were minor figures and typically representing a typical protagonist, a hedonistic protagonist who were out there on drugs and sexually perverse, misogynist in nature. But Anatole Barjot was someone who was known for coming up with this La Decadence as a literary periodical. And this La Decadence, this journal, in fact, was this institution as well. The idea of journey behind La Decadence was joined by Baudelaire and Huysmans, and then Baudelaire, and of course we had D'Annunzio, the Italian one, the Italian literature, Gabriel D'Annunzio, uh, very important works, some of the important works that form the part of the Decadence literature. So, although Anatole Bajou certainly inaugurated this La Decadent as a periodical, but more or less he was seen as a minor sort of a figure who was writing very typical of these, not exploring them in depth. Why, if certain protagonists were indulging in this kind of manner, what was the reason behind it? So, a literary journal that continued through 1889, the public image of decadence was given its most forceful expression in Abrabos. Now, this was a work that was against nature, written by Horace Carl Huysmans, that I was talking about, which the contemporary English critics, artist, and of course, contemporary English critic Arthur Symons called it as a brilliant one. The typical decadent hero that I was talking of. The typical decadent hero, he would live by himself, he would nourish his own substance, and then after having strained and enervated by it, his mind would fall victim to a sluggish which annihilated his plans, broke down his willpower, and invoked a quantity of vague reveries to which he would ultimately and passively submit. The confused medley of meditations on art and literature in which he had indulged, that is, this decadent hero would typically find himself indulge in arts and literature and the different cultural forms of art. Now, the confused medley of meditations on art and literature in which he had indulged since his isolation, as a dam to bar the current of old memories, had been rudely swept away, and the onrushing, irresistible wave crashed into the present and future, submerging everything. So, almost metaphorically, this has been described that his ultimately brings into his downfall, and with his downfall came his wisdom, filling his mind with an immensity of sorrow in whose service floated like a futile wreckage. It's more like metaphorically he's taken a point of view to explain. So these characters would be ugly and bereft of spiritual significance as modern civilization. Transcendence could only be found through deliberate artifice, that is, redecadence. Nature, as revealed by contemporary science, was presented by arts. So that very idea of spirituality, if at all it becomes the motive, on the surface of it, it would certainly not be there. But if at all, it has to be reached through the stages of transcendence, through the stages of decadence, that is, redecadence. Now, some of the quotes to reinforce how real and truthful these creative artists, these novelists had been towards their art. The books that the world call immoral are the books that show the world its own shame. So unless you get an idea of what black is, you cannot know until you know what white is. So Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, the only way to get rid of temptation is to yield. There's a very popular adage by Oscar Wilde in The Picture of the Dorian Gray. The only way to get rid of temptation is to first experience it and then lead to this final wisdom that this temptation can finally be discarded. Then these are some of I wanted the participants to experience Huysmans' Against Nature. Very interesting novel, and probably we can take up a couple of notes if we have time. Yes, it's 1911. Okay, the belief that man is an irresolute creature pulls this way, and that by two forces of equal strength, alternately winning and losing the battle of his soul, the conviction that human life is nothing more than uncertain struggle between heaven and hell, the faith in two opposed entities, Satan and Christ, all this was bound to engender those internal discords in which the soul, excited by the incessant fighting, stimulates itself, stimulated, as it were, by the constant promises and threats, ending up by giving in and prostitutes itself to whichever of the two combatants had been more obstinate in its pull, the good or the evil. Horace Carl Huysmans, Against Nature. And of course, final one, I took this Gabriele D'Annunzio, Home Paradiso. Although this particular poetic work, his poems from this work was banned, were seen as immoral, if not banned, but they met with a lot of censorship. They were seen as immoral completely. But D'Annunzio's, Gabriel D'Annunzio's This Poetic Piece probably explains out the zeitgeist, the age, decadent movement, the trend in its entirety. Within a hell of godless emptiness, submit yourself evermore to sleep's spell. All is a dream, all is nothingness. The flower of the world is the asphodel. Can we think of existentialism coming out from as an offshoot of decadent movements? Yes, we certainly can, because Nietzsche was writing at the same time, and a lot of these other existentialist writers. Of course, the circumstances were equally important. War happened, the World War, the two World War happened. There was this general, in America, there was this depression movement, that is, the Great Depression happened, and because of this Great Depression, its depictions in through avant-gardist form found itself an echo by which man and its futility of existence started to get questioned. And that's how we find that later other different movements of theatre of absurd or Bottlebrecht epic theatre, all these trends started to emerge in different forms. And with this, I end the discussion of the four movements, that is realism, naturalism, magic realism, and decadent movements. Although, as I said, we were discussing it earlier, a great deal of discussion needs to follow. Almost a discourse on each of these age can follow up almost in maybe every 2 to 3 hours. But because we have to be very selective as to be what is to be the most appropriate way of delineating or depicting the zeitgeist of the age, or the best possible means of an age, that's what constitutes the span of these four movements within 2 hours.
Thank you,
And
Dr. Bhawna.
Already 9:15.
Thank you for a very systematic presentation, and thank you for dealing with the essence of these movements, which we had to focus on. In spite of the technical glitches, I must confess that the session has been a very engaging one, and you have truly justified the topic that had been assigned, and we are so happy and proud to have assigned you this topic. So thank you very much on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE for taking up this pain. As the clock has ticked beyond 9, so obviously it's a dinner time for all of us. We will not take questions. We will not take many questions. Only 2 questions we will take. The rest of the questions we will mail you, and you please write the answers that you read, and along with the book chapter we might include it. If not, we will ensure that it reaches the participants.
Yeah.
So
we do have questions here.
There is one question which might be helpful for all of us when we teach magic realism. So the question is by, of course, a teacher. He says that when I teach magic realism, I would like to use art to teach the elements of form better, and as creative writing prompts. So any ideas that you can share as a teacher, any art forms that we can use, or any props we can use, so that we put this topic, we clarify this topic more better to the students?
Right. Probably different art forms can take into account when magic realism has to be explained. I think the presentist approach is quite appropriate. Think of the present circumstances, and if I may consider pandemic to be a common situation, common denomination in all of our classroom settings and all of our different countries. Think of how this virus takes up different shapes and takes up different form, and ultimately disturbs a different country and almost borders on the idea of fantastic as well as newness, the novelty of the idea of novelty to it. How this virus ultimately probably enlarges itself and takes into account the entire of the world, and a lot of these new things. And in fact, you can raise this question very much to the students. This is a microscopic virus. None of us can probably, we all can sense it, we all can feel about it, we all can be anxious about it. But when it comes to seeing it, think of this virus taking up a particular shape to be visible, to be able to be visible to normal naked eyes. And then where can the imagination of a student run? How far can they run? How interesting that can be made. So these elements, along with a fictional character and his life when it is created, say a particular household, a particular character is taken into account, the impact of that virus and how it has been turned on into, say, a realistic entity. This is something can give rise to the very idea, the component of magic realism. And of course, take into account how the narrative can also be infused to criticize the institutions, the governments, how fair these governments had been in dealing with these situations at large. How well have they fared? Think of Oedipus Rex. Think Oedipus, when his country, when Athens was marred by the Great Plague and epidemic happened in Athens, how quick as a statesman this man was, who went a stage ahead, who went miles away to discover this cause of pandemic, this cause of this local plague that happened, this epidemic that happened, and in a way rectified it as well. Now, with the use of magic realism, this virus is visible, it's hiding, but how well are these governments doing? So politically, you can seep in different narratives of social cultural criticism, social political criticism, take into account the general economic degradation of the society, how maybe people on the margins have to face the worst of these, the virus, and probably the virus is affecting the elite classes only. So the more you tell your students to think of these imaginative ways by which magic realism as an element could be incorporated, the better you'll engage them into this kind of imaginative activity. And of course, different number of ideas can also pop up at the same time.
Thank you for putting forward such a wonderful idea of how to deal with this very pertinent movement, a very pertinent school of thought, magic realism. We take the next question. The next question is like Darwinism. You talked about Darwin's evolution of species and Darwinism. So Darwinism gave rise to a hierarchical structure for species. So does this hierarchical structure or view also extend itself in literature?
Certainly. See, literature is usually dominated by, unless we find someone who is so-called blessed with or born with this credibility, born with this talent, literature will always usually find itself to be dominated by the elite classes. The survival of the fittest is something, whosoever survives has to be good enough. And who is good enough? Who's at least privileged to reach up to these stages? And who are these privileged one who are somehow taking away the agencies of those on the margins? And this is where Spivak would come up, and she would rightly question, can the subaltern really speak? Because neither they have the opportunities nor they have the right voice to be able to put forth themselves. And at the same time, we would need these voices. And this is where even the elitists, the so-called bourgeois class, is necessary to bring down the right kind of revolutions in the society. In fact, the very decadence takes place in any society when the elite or the bourgeois stops to take action against the ills of the society, and it somehow accepts it. Because the lower ones, those who are the proletariat or those who are on the margins, at max they're able to carry themselves out as foot soldiers. They cannot bring up these huge revolutions unless they are directed by some trailblazer, unless they're directed as a direction given by some leader. And these leaders, of course, it can come up from these very own people, but it has to again go back to the concept of whosoever is the fittest of them all would be able to survive them. And that's how they can be the trailblazer to change as well. I hope, because I cannot see.
So you have very beautifully put forward this question, and I will forward all these questions to your mail so that you can have time, go through it, and answer at your will. So with that, we come to the end of a thoroughly exciting and engaging session. Thank you very much for such a lucid lecture and an informative lecture on this very important schools and movements. So words are not enough to express our gratitude for a very, very engaging and sound session. It was very engaging, very encouraging, as well as very informative session. Thank you very much for your lucid presentation. On behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, we would like to have you in the near future also. People like you all add glory and honor to our platform. Thank you as always for accepting our invitation. Thank you for delivering such a wonderful lecture. On behalf of Team DAATH Voyage and Gnosis, please take care. Good night. If you have time, please do join like you have been in the future lectures as well. Take care. Good night. Good night, participants.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for our wonderful audience and the participants who have been patient enough to, stay themselves back till 9:30. And this has been really a wonderful journey with number of questions, and of course, engaging with them. It's in itself quite an engaging journey. Thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.